102 missed calls. All from the exact same number. A number I had memorized, blocked, unblocked, and blocked again more times than I could possibly count over the past 10 years. I sat alone in my corner office, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The rain was beating heavily against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the industrial skyline of our Pennsylvania city glittering behind me like a crown I had built with my own blood, sweat, and endless patience. I was 24 years old now. I owned a logistics empire. I had power, money, and respect. But the caller ID blinking on my desk didn't care about any of that. It simply read Genevieve. My mother. The woman who had looked me dead in the eyes on a freezing, brutal night 10 years ago and said words that were permanently burned into my soul. You will be dead in a ditch by winter. Do not ever show your face here until you are ready to get on your knees and beg. I was only 14 years old when she slammed that heavy oak door in my face. I had nothing but 2 black garbage bags filled with my clothes, $42 in my pocket, and a dignity that I absolutely refused to let her destroy. I did not get on my knees. I did not cry out for her to open the door. I turned my back, walked away into the freezing dark, and I never looked back. Not once. Now, 10 years later, the roles were entirely reversed. The phone kept vibrating. 103. 104. The calls were relentless, vibrating with the sheer desperation of a woman who was watching her entire world burn to the ground. Before I tell you exactly why I let it ring, and why I sat there feeling absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction, I need to take you back to the night my life shattered. I need to tell you about the secret my mother buried, and how I crawled out of the grave she dug for me. It was late November. Our family owned a mid-sized freight and logistics company. It was supposed to be my grandmother's legacy, but under my mother's control, it was constantly teetering on the edge of crisis. I grew up in a massive, sprawling house that never once felt like a home. It felt like a stage, and I was the prop that everyone hated. I was the scapegoat, the invisible child, the one who was blamed for every single thing that went wrong. The golden child, on the other hand, was my younger sister, Cora. Cora was 12 at the time. She had perfect blonde hair, an innocent smile, and a talent for causing absolute chaos and walking away completely untouched. That night, the air smelled like burning plastic and disaster. Cora had been playing with emergency road flares from one of the company supply trucks parked near the main storage facility. She was supposed to be inside studying, but Genevieve never disciplined her. Cora lit a flare, got scared when it sparked too brightly, and threw it into a pile of wooden pallets stacked against the VIP warehouse. I was taking out the trash when I saw the flames. I screamed for help, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and ran toward the blaze. By the time the fire department arrived, half the warehouse was a smoking, blackened ruin. Thousands of dollars of high-value client inventory had been reduced to ash. It was a catastrophic loss for the company. Genevieve pulled up in her luxury SUV, her face pale with terror. She didn't ask if we were okay. She looked at the smoking ruins, then looked at Cora, who was sobbing hysterically, her hands covered in black soot. Then, my mother looked at me. I was holding the empty fire extinguisher. My face was covered in sweat and ash from trying to put it out. I watched the gears turning in her head. She knew Cora did it. We both knew. But Cora was her perfect angel, and a police report naming a 12-year-old playing with company equipment would lead to a massive insurance investigation. It would ruin them. Genevieve grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging so deep into my skin that I almost screamed. She dragged me behind the remaining trucks, out of sight of the firefighters. Her eyes were wild, calculating, and completely devoid of a mother's love. "You are going to tell the police that you were smoking behind the warehouse," she hissed, her breath hot against my face. "You dropped a cigarette into the pallets. It was an accident. Tell them." I stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her demand. "What? No, I don't even smoke." Cora threw a flare. "She's standing right there covered in soot." Genevieve shook me violently. "Listen to me, you ungrateful brat. If they find out Cora did this, the insurance will void our policy. We will lose everything. You are already a problem child. Nobody will care if you made a mistake. I will handle the police. Just keep your mouth shut and nod. No, I said. My voice was trembling, but the word was clear. I won't lie. I won't go to juvenile detention for her. My mother's expression shifted. The panic vanished, replaced by a terrifying, cold rage. She let go of my arm and smoothed down her designer coat. Fine, she whispered. 10 minutes later, I watched in absolute horror as my mother stood with the police chief. She was crying fake, perfect tears. She pointed directly at me. I heard her say the words. She is out of control. She has been stealing cigarettes. She is rebellious. She hates this family. She did this on purpose to punish me. The police questioned me. I told the truth, but who believes a messy, ash-covered 14-year-old over a wealthy, sobbing mother in a designer coat? They gave me a severe warning, cited me for vandalism, and released me into my mother's custody. The moment we got back to that massive, cold house, the true nightmare began. Genevieve didn't say a word. She marched up to my room, grabbed 2 heavy-duty trash bags, and started throwing my clothes into them. Shirts, pants, my winter coat, everything. Get out, she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Mom, please, I whispered, panic finally setting in. It's freezing outside. I'm 14. Where am I supposed to go? My stepfather, Maxwell, stood in the hallway. He just looked down at his shoes, saying absolutely nothing. He was a coward, an enabling shadow of a man who let my mother do whatever she wanted. Cora was peeking out from her bedroom door, watching me get thrown out for a crime she committed. Genevieve grabbed me by the collar of my sweater and dragged me down the stairs. I was slipping, trying to find my footing, but she was fueled by pure, toxic rage. She opened the front door. The winter wind howled, blowing freezing snow onto the hardwood floor. She threw the 2 garbage bags out onto the driveway. Then, she shoved me out into the cold. I stumbled and fell onto the icy pavement. The cold seeped through my thin sweater instantly. I looked up at the woman who was supposed to protect me. You want to ruin this family? She spat. Then you don't get to be a part of it. You are dead to me. You will be dead in a ditch by winter. Do not ever show your face here until you are ready to get on your knees and beg. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The lock clicked. I sat there in the snow for a long time. The wind bit at my face, numbing my cheeks. I dug into my pocket and pulled out my life savings. $42. That was it. I looked at the dark windows of the house. I could have pounded on the door. I could have cried. I could have promised to lie to the police, to be a good scapegoat, to accept the abuse. But I didn't. I stood up. I picked up my 2 trash bags. I turned my back on the Sterling family, and I walked away into the darkness with my head held high. I only had $42 and a very long, brutal road ahead of me. But what Genevieve didn't know, what she could not possibly understand in her arrogance, was that by throwing me out into the snow, she had just thrown away the only key that could ever save her empire. I walked for miles that night. The snow was falling heavier now, sticking to my hair and melting down the back of my neck. The plastic garbage bags dug into my raw, freezing fingers. Every step I took away from that house felt like a physical tearing, a violent separation from the only world I had ever known. But mixed with the terror of being completely homeless at 14, there was a strange, toxic clarity. Being thrown out didn't happen in a vacuum. It was simply the grand finale of a lifetime of being treated like an unwanted infection. As I trudged through the icy streets of our industrial town, passing dark factories and empty lots, I opened the doors to what I now call my museum of pain. I let myself remember exactly why I was never going back. My first artifact in this museum was a shiny, gold-plated math trophy. I was 10 years old when I won the state championship. I had studied every single night for months, hiding in the laundry room just to get some quiet away from Cora's tantrums. When I brought the trophy home, my heart was hammering with pride. I placed it carefully on the mantel in the living room, hoping, just for 1 second, my mother would look at me and smile. The next morning, the trophy was gone. In its place was a massive, terrifying porcelain doll wearing a Victorian dress. I found my trophy later that afternoon. It was in the kitchen trash can, buried under coffee grounds and eggshells. When I confronted Genevieve, crying, she didn't even look up from her iPad. She just sipped her coffee and said, "It was taking up too much space, Sloan. Cora needed room to display her new collection. Don't be so dramatic over a piece of cheap plastic." The second artifact was my 12th birthday. By then, I had stopped expecting presents, but I thought maybe, just maybe, I would get a cake. A single cupcake. Anything. I sat at the kitchen island for 3 hours that evening. Genevieve and Maxwell had hosted a corporate luncheon for the logistics company earlier that day. At 8 o'clock at night, Genevieve walked into the kitchen, saw me sitting there, and sighed like my existence was a massive inconvenience. She opened the fridge, pulled out a styrofoam container of leftover, soggy catering sandwiches, and slid it across the marble counter. "Happy birthday. Eat over the sink. I just had the floors cleaned." I ate a cold turkey sandwich in silence, watching my tears hit the stainless steel basin. But the third artifact was the one that taught me who these people truly were. I was 13. I caught a severe strain of the flu. My fever spiked to 104 degrees. I was delirious, shivering so hard my teeth were chipping, and my throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. I couldn't stop moaning from the body aches. I was curled in a ball on my bedroom floor because the sheets felt too hot. Maxwell, my spineless stepfather, opened my door at 2 in the morning. He didn't bring medicine. He didn't bring a cold washcloth. He looked at me, his face twisted in annoyance. "Sloan, you need to shut up," he whispered harshly. "Your mother has a very important board meeting tomorrow, and your whining is keeping her awake. If you make one more sound, I am locking you in the basement." He closed the door. I shoved a pillow into my mouth and bit down on it until my gums bled, just to keep myself from making a sound while my brain practically boiled inside my skull. That was my family. A collection of monsters wearing expensive clothes. The only light in that entire dark museum of a childhood was my grandmother, Beatrice. Beatrice was the founder of the company. She was tough, brilliant, and she smelled like expensive tobacco and peppermint. She was the only person who looked at me and saw a human being. But Beatrice had passed away when I was 12, leaving me completely unprotected against Genevieve's cruelty. As I dragged my bags through the snow, my mind drifted to the last time I saw my grandmother. She was in a hospital bed, hooked up to a dozen beeping machines. Her lungs were failing, but her eyes were still sharp as broken glass. Genevieve was pacing out in the hallway, loudly complaining to Maxwell about how much the private suite was costing them. Beatrice had gripped my small hand with a strength that terrified me. She pulled me close, her breath rattling in her chest. "Sloan, listen to me," she wheezed, her eyes starting toward the door to make sure my mother wasn't listening. "You are smarter than all of them combined. You have my blood. Do not let that woman break you." I had nodded, crying silently. "When you are old enough," Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible, "find Everett. He is my lawyer. He has the real papers. Do not trust your mother. Promise me, Sloan. Find Everett." Then the machines started screaming, the nurses rushed in, and I was shoved out into the hallway. I never spoke to her again. She died that night. Find Everett. He has the real papers. For 2 years, those words had haunted me. I didn't know what papers she meant. I assumed it was some small inheritance, maybe enough to pay for college so I could finally escape. But I was 14 now. I couldn't sign a contract, I couldn't hire a lawyer, I couldn't even rent a motel room. I was a child. I stopped walking. My legs were giving out. The snow was piling up around my boots. I had reached the edge of the commercial district. The neon sign of an all-night laundromat buzzed in the darkness. It was open. It was warm. It was my only option. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The smell of cheap detergent and stale bleach hit my nose. There were no customers, just rows of humming, spinning machines. I dragged my garbage bags behind a row of oversized industrial dryers, curled myself into a tight ball on the cold linoleum floor, and finally allowed myself to cry. I cried until I couldn't breathe. I cried for the math trophy, for the cold sandwiches, for the feverish nights, and for the mother who had looked at her child and wished her dead. Have you ever been punished for someone else's mistake just because you were the easiest target in the room? Have you ever felt that completely isolating coldness of knowing your own family doesn't care if you survive the night? If you have, you know exactly what kind of fire that starts in your chest. Let me tell you how a 14-year-old homeless girl takes that fire and burns down an empire. Survival at 14 years old is not an adventure. It is a brutal, humiliating, and exhausting full-time job. The real world doesn't care if you are smart or if you have a tragic backstory. The real world only cares if you have money. And I had $42. For the first 2 months, I lived like a ghost. The laundromat became my sanctuary. The owner, an old man who barely spoke English, pretended not to notice me sleeping behind the dryers from midnight until 6 in the morning, as long as I wiped down the folding tables and swept the floors before he arrived. That was my rent. Food was the hardest part. $42 vanished in a week. I learned very quickly where the local diners threw out their slightly stale bread and bruised fruit. I learned how to slip into the back of grocery stores and check the dumpsters before the garbage trucks arrived. It sounds disgusting, and it was, but when your stomach is cramping so hard you can't stand up straight, pride disappears very quickly. Eventually, I found a job washing dishes at a rundown diner on the edge of the highway. The manager knew I was underage, he knew I was homeless, and he absolutely took advantage of it. He paid me under the table in cash. For $50 an hour. It was illegal, it was slave labor, but it kept me alive. My hands were constantly cracked and bleeding from the industrial soap. My back ached from standing on hard tile for 10 hours a shift. In the first 2 months, my clothes hung off me like rags. I had lost 15 pounds, dropping to a skeletal weight that made my cheekbones look like they were going to pierce through my skin. But I was surviving. Then, one freezing morning in February, I went to the local public library to use the free internet. I wanted to check my mother's public social media accounts. I don't know why. Maybe part of me, the pathetic, broken child part, hoped she had posted a missing person flyer. Hoped she was looking for me. Instead, I found a local news article about the logistics company. There was a photo of Genevieve, smiling warmly, receiving an award for local business leadership. But it was the caption underneath a secondary photo that made my blood freeze in my veins. The caption read, Genevieve Sterling, pictured with her daughter Cora, recently established the Sterling Education Grant after taking full legal control of the family's private trust following the tragic estrangement of her eldest troubled daughter. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I pulled up public court records using the library database. It took me 3 hours of digging, but I found it. Genevieve hadn't just thrown me out. She had gone to a judge. She had filed legal documents claiming I was an uncontrollable runaway, a danger to myself and others. But she didn't file for police intervention. She filed a petition to dissolve my guardianship status to sever financial ties. Why? Because my grandmother Beatrice had set up an education trust fund in my name. It was locked, supposed to be released when I turned 18. Genevieve had used the false police report from the warehouse fire to prove I was a delinquent. She claimed the trust money was better served being absorbed back into the company to prevent bankruptcy. She essentially signed away her rights as my mother, legally classifying me as an emancipated minor through abandonment, just so she could steal my college money to fix the financial hole Cora had created by burning down the warehouse. She didn't just throw me away. She robbed me on the way out. I sat in that quiet library, staring at the screen until the letters blurred. The last tiny thread of hope I had for my mother snapped. The sadness evaporated. What replaced it was a cold, dense, terrifying anger. It was the kind of anger that doesn't scream. It calculates. I needed a better job. I needed money. Washing dishes wasn't going to build a war chest. My break came in late March. The diner I worked at was located right next to a massive industrial truck yard. 18-wheelers constantly rolled in and out, moving freight across state lines. I used to watch them from the back alley while taking out the trash. One night, around 2 in the morning, I was carrying a heavy bag of food waste to the dumpster when I heard a metallic clinking sound coming from the truck yard. The area was supposed to be secured, surrounded by a chain-link fence, but there was a blind spot near the rear gate. I dropped the garbage bag and crept closer to the fence. Under the dim orange glow of a street lamp, I saw two men in dark hoodies crouching beside a parked Peterbilt semi-truck. They had tools. They were trying to steal the catalytic converter and the expensive battery units. I didn't think. I just reacted. I grabbed a heavy, rusted iron pipe that was lying near the dumpster, climbed the chain-link fence with the agility of a desperate rat, and dropped down into the truck yard. "Hey!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, banging the iron pipe violently against the side of the metal dumpster. "Security! Cops! Hey! Get the hell away from the truck!" The two thieves jumped, startled by the sheer volume of my screaming. They looked at me, a skinny, filthy teenager holding a pipe like a baseball bat, and hesitated. But then the loud, blaring sound of a siren erupted from the main office building. Floodlights snapped on, blindingly bright. The thieves panicked, dropped their tools, and scrambled over the far side of the fence, vanishing into the night. I stood there, panting, my hands shaking so hard I dropped the iron pipe. A heavy metal door banged open from the office. Out marched a woman who looked like she could wrestle a bear and win. She was in her late 50s, wearing steel-toed boots, heavily stained mechanics jeans, and a thick flannel shirt. She had silver hair pulled back into a tight bun and a permanent scowl etched into her deeply lined face. She was holding a heavy-duty flashlight like a weapon. She marched over to the truck, looked at the dropped tools, and then shined the blinding flashlight directly into my face. I threw my hands up to block the glare. "You," the woman barked, her voice deep and raspy from years of smoking. "You the one who started screaming?" "Yes," I squinted, trying not to look intimidated. "They were trying to strip your rig." I scared them off. She lowered the flashlight, evaluating me from head to toe. She took in my oversized, dirty clothes, my skeletal frame, and the fact that it was 2 a.m. and I was clearly homeless. "What's your name, kid?" she asked. "Sloan." "I'm Vivian," she said, crossing her massive arms. "I own this yard. What are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" "I work next door washing dishes," I said, my voice steady. "I saw them. I stopped them. You owe me." Vivian raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by my absolute lack of fear. "I owe you, huh? You're a bold little street rat. How old are you?" 18, I lied without blinking. "I was 14 and a half. Vivian snorted. "Bullshit. You're barely 15. But you got guts, I'll give you that. Those catalytic converters are worth $3,000 apiece. You saved me a lot of money and a massive headache with dispatch tomorrow." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a thick leather wallet, and extracted a crisp $50 bill. She held it out to me. I looked at the money. It was more than I made in 2 days of washing dishes. My stomach growled. But my brain was moving faster. I remembered my mother's logistics company. I remembered the trucks. I needed an education in this industry if I was ever going to take it back. I didn't take the 50. I looked Vivian dead in the eye. "I don't want your money," I said. "I want a job. Real work. Not washing dishes. I'll sweep the yard, I'll clean the trucks, I'll organize the manifests. I work harder than anyone you've ever met, and I don't complain." Vivian stared at me in total silence for a long, uncomfortable moment. The wind howled around us. Finally, a slow, grim smile spread across her face. She put the 50 back in her wallet. "You're a tough little stray," she muttered. "Fine. You want to work? You show up here tomorrow at 6 a.m. sharp. You're late by 1 minute, you're fired. I pay minimum wage on the books. You need an ID and a social." "I don't have them," I said, my heart sinking. I can't be on the books." Vivian looked at me, really looked at me this time. She saw the desperation I was trying so hard to hide. She sighed heavily, running a calloused hand over her face. "Cash it is. But you work twice as hard." "Understood. Understood." As I turned to climb back over the fence, Vivian called out, "Sloan." I looked back. "There's an old shipping container behind the main garage," she said casually, not looking at me. "I insulated it last year. Got a cot and a space heater in there. If a stray cat happened to wander in there at night to sleep, I wouldn't call animal control." My throat tightened. Tears pricked my eyes, but I forced them back. I nodded once. "Thanks, Vivian." That night, I didn't sleep behind the dryers at the laundromat. I slept on a thin canvas cot inside a metal shipping container, huddled next to a glowing orange space heater. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. I was safe. I was warm. And I had a mentor. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing for war. The next 4 years were a blur of diesel fuel, grease, and relentless, agonizing labor. I didn't have a normal teenage life. There were no high school proms, no first dates at the movies, no worrying about what to wear on Friday night. My life consisted of waking up at 5 in the morning, working in Vivian's yard until my muscles screamed, and then spending every single night studying in the back office until my eyes blurred. Vivian was tough as nails, but she was fair. She taught me everything about the freight business. I learned how to dispatch trucks, how to negotiate shipping rates with brokers, how to read complex manifest logs, and how to spot a bad deal from a mile away. By the time I was 16, I was practically running her back office. Simultaneously, I was completing my high school education online. It cost me sleep, but I refused to remain uneducated. Knowledge was the only weapon Genevieve couldn't confiscate. On my 18th birthday, I didn't celebrate. I didn't buy a cake. I put on the only professional suit I owned, bought from a thrift store and carefully tailored by my own hands, and I took a bus 3 towns over to a corporate address I had memorized from my grandmother's dying words. Everett and Associates. The law office was intimidating. Polished mahogany, leather chairs, and the smell of expensive coffee. The receptionist looked at my cheap suit and almost turned me away, but when I gave her my name, Sloane Sterling, her demeanor instantly shifted. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Everett. He was an older man, distinguished, with sharp gray eyes that looked exactly like a hawk assessing its prey. He steepled his fingers, staring at me across his massive desk. "I have been waiting for you to walk through that door for 4 years, Miss Sterling," Everett said quietly. "Your grandmother Beatrice was a very dear friend of mine. I was devastated to hear you had run away." "I didn't run away," I stated coldly. "My mother threw me out into a snowstorm and told me to die in a ditch. Then she legally abandoned me to steal my education trust." Everett didn't look shocked. He looked disgusted. He opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. "Beatrice knew," he said softly. "She knew Genevieve was a predator. That is why she came to me in secret, 3 months before her health rapidly declined." Everett broke the seal on the envelope and slid a heavy stack of legal documents across the desk. I looked down at the first page. It was a last will and testament. The signature at the bottom was Beatrice's. "This is the authentic, legally binding will of your grandmother, executed and notarized in my presence," Everett explained, leaning forward. "In this document, Beatrice left exactly 10% of the logistics company to your mother, Genevieve, 30% to your sister, Cora, and the controlling majority, 60% of the entire empire, was left entirely to you." My breath hitched. The room spun slightly. 60%. I was the majority shareholder. I owned the company. "But," I stammered, tracing my grandmother's signature with a trembling finger, "Genevieve has full control. She's the CEO. She owns it all on paper." "How?" Everett's face darkened with absolute fury. "Because your mother and your stepfather, Maxwell, committed a massive, coordinated fraud. 2 weeks before Beatrice died, while she was heavily medicated and slipping in and out of consciousness, Genevieve brought in her own lawyers. Maxwell, as a notary, falsified the date and the mental competency evaluation. They forced a dying woman to sign a revoked version of the will, leaving everything to Genevieve. By the time I found out, Beatrice was dead and Genevieve had a judge seal the estate." "Why didn't you fight it?" I demanded, anger flaring up. "I tried," Everett said defensively. "But I needed you. As the primary beneficiary of the original will, You had to be the one to contest the forgery. But you vanished. Genevieve filed a police report claiming you were an addict who ran away. She painted you as an unstable, unreliable witness. If I had brought this to court without you, she would have destroyed my career and buried the original will forever. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the betrayal crushing my chest. My mother hadn't just thrown me out because she favored Cora. She threw me out because I was the only person standing between her and total control of the company. She got rid of the heir so she could steal the crown. Can we sue her now? I asked, my voice tight. I'm 18. I'm legally an adult. I have the original will. Everett shook his head slowly. We could. But it would be a bloodbath. Genevieve has millions of dollars at her disposal. She has corporate lawyers who will drag this out in court for a decade. She will hire private investigators to dig into your life as a homeless teenager. She will smear your name, and she will bankrupt you before a judge ever hears the case. You have the truth, Sloan, but you do not have the power. He was right. I was an 18-year-old girl living in a shipping container, working dispatch at a dirt lot truck yard. If I went to war with Genevieve now, I would be crushed like a bug. So what do? I whispered. Everett looked at me, his hawk eyes gleaming with a dangerous kind of respect. Beatrice left a stipulation in the original will. Your inheritance, the 60%, legally transfers to you on your 25th birthday. That gives you exactly 7 years. 7 years to build your own power. 7 years to gather the resources, the money, and the evidence to prove the forgery. When you turn 25, we strike. We don't just sue her. We execute a corporate takeover. I looked down at the documents. 60%. An empire stolen by a monster. I thought about the garbage bags in the snow. I thought about the $4.50 an hour. I thought about the frozen nights in the laundromat. I looked up at Everett. I wasn't crying. I was smiling. Keep the documents in a safe, I said, my voice cold and steady. I have work to do. I walked out of that law office a different person. Genevieve thought she had buried me. She thought I was rotting in some ditch, forgotten and broken. But she didn't realize the truth. I wasn't buried. I was a seed. And I had just started to sprout. By the time I turned 21, the seed had grown into a weapon. I didn't stay in the shipping container forever. I saved every single penny I earned working for Vivian. I didn't buy new clothes, I didn't go out, I didn't waste a dime. I studied the logistics market like a predator studying a herd. I saw the massive gaps in how the big companies, including my mother's, were treating their clients. They were slow, arrogant, and they overcharged for basic reliability. With Vivian's blessing and a small loan she personally guaranteed, I filed the paperwork to launch my own logistics brokerage. I called it Apex Freight. I didn't put my name on any public-facing documents. I registered the company as an LLC, hiding behind corporate anonymity. To the outside world, Apex Freight was just a new, aggressive competitor entering the regional market. To me, it was the army I was building to destroy Genevieve. I couldn't do it alone. I needed someone who understood numbers the way I understood operations. That's when I hired Declan. Declan was a 23-year-old accounting genius who had just been fired from a massive corporate firm because he refused to help them hide assets during an audit. He was brilliant, fiercely ethical, and completely broke. We met in a cheap coffee shop. I pitched him my vision. I told him we were going to build a company that moved freight faster, cheaper, and more reliably than anyone in the state. I didn't tell him about my mother, not yet. He looked at my fierce, terrifying determination, drank his black coffee, and said, I'm in. Apex Freight started in a tiny, windowless office above a bowling alley. Declan handled the finances and the legal compliance. I handled the sales, the dispatch, and the aggressive expansion. Within 2 years, we went from managing 3 independent trucks to coordinating a fleet of 50. We were stealing mid-level clients directly out from under Genevieve's nose, and she had absolutely no idea that the phantom CEO of Apex Freight was the daughter she threw away. But as Apex grew, so did my surveillance on Genevieve. I had set up Google Alerts, paid for access to industry databases, and quietly befriended low-level employees at my mother's company. What I learned sickened me. Genevieve wasn't just a terrible mother, she was a tyrant of a boss. One afternoon, my inside contact sent me a message. Genevieve had just publicly fired a man named Arthur. Arthur had been a driver for my grandmother for 20 years. He was loyal, hardworking, and deeply respected. He had requested a half-day off to go to the hospital because his wife was having a biopsy for suspected cancer. Genevieve denied the request, citing a high-priority shipment. Arthur went anyway. When he returned, Genevieve fired him in the middle of the dispatch floor, stripped his pension, and had security escort him out like a criminal. It was a blatant, disgusting display of cruelty. It showed exactly who she was. But her cruelty wasn't limited to her own employees. Genevieve was feeling the pressure from new competitors like Apex Freight eating into her profit margins. Since she couldn't beat us fairly by providing better service, she resorted to the only tactic she knew: sabotage. It happened on a Tuesday in October. Declan burst into my office, his face completely pale. He was holding a stack of legal notices. "Sloan, we have a massive problem," he said, his voice shaking. "The Department of Transportation just issued an emergency suspension on our operating authority. All our trucks are grounded. Immediately." I stood up so fast my chair crashed into the wall. "What? Why? We are fully compliant. Our safety scores are perfect." Declan slammed the papers on my desk. Someone filed multiple anonymous whistleblower complaints to the DOT. They fabricated evidence claiming we are running illegal, overweight loads, falsifying driver logbooks to hide exhaustion, and skipping mandatory brake inspections. The DOT is launching a full audit. Until they clear us, we can't move a single piece of freight. Our clients are going to panic. If we can't deliver this week, we violate our contracts, and we go bankrupt. My blood turned to ice. It was a coordinated attack. I looked at the complaints. They were incredibly detailed, using industry-specific jargon that only an insider would know. I called Vivian immediately. When I explained the situation, she didn't sound surprised. She sounded furious. "It's Genevieve," Vivian growled over the phone. "She did the exact same thing to my husband 15 years ago. That's why I'm running a dirt lot instead of a corporate fleet. She uses ghost IP addresses to submit fake safety violations to the feds. It bogs the competitor down in legal red tape for months. By the time the DOT clears you, your clients have all jumped ship to her company because they need their freight moved. It's a corporate death sentence." I hung up the phone. The panic tried to claw its way up my throat, but I forced it down. Genevieve thought she was stepping on a bug. She didn't realize the bug had venom. "Declan," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Lock the doors. Order black coffee. We are not sleeping." For the next 72 hours, we turned that windowless office into a war room. We didn't sleep. We barely ate. We pulled every single GPS tracking log, every electronic logging device record, every maintenance receipt, and every way station ticket for our entire fleet for the past 12 months. We cross-referenced every single fabricated accusation in the anonymous complaint with hard, undeniable, time-stamped digital proof that we were innocent. I personally called every single one of our major clients. I didn't lie to them. I told them we were under a targeted smear campaign by a corporate rival, but I guaranteed their freight would move. I subcontracted the urgent loads to Vivian's yard at a massive financial loss just to keep my promise to my clients. On Friday morning, Declan and I walked into the regional DOT office carrying 4 massive binders of irrefutable evidence. We didn't just defend ourselves, we proved that the anonymous complaints were mathematically impossible. More importantly, Declan's brilliant forensic accounting tracked the metadata of the anonymous emails back to a proxy server that had a billing address linked to a shell company controlled by Sterling Logistics. The DOT inspector looked at the evidence, stunned. He lifted the suspension immediately and forwarded our findings to the Federal Fraud Division. We survived. We took a massive financial hit, but we survived. Genevieve had swung for the neck, and she had missed. And now, she was on the federal radar for corporate sabotage. I collapsed onto the floor of my office that night, utterly exhausted, staring at the ceiling. Declan sat next to me, nursing a warm beer. You know, Declan said quietly, looking at me. You fight like someone who has nothing to lose. But you also fight like this is personal. I looked at him. I trusted him. He had just stayed awake for 3 days to save my company. It is personal, Declan, I whispered in the dark. The CEO of Sterling Logistics is my mother. Declan slowly put his beer down. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded slowly. Okay, then we don't just beat her. We destroy her. By the time I was 23, Apex Freight was no longer a scrappy startup. We had moved into a sleek, modern office building. We had a staff of 40 people. Our annual revenue had just crossed $4,200,000. We were a legitimate threat in the market, a force of nature that was systematically dismantling Genevieve's market share piece by piece. And still, she didn't know I was the one holding the knife. I was sitting in my office late one evening, reviewing expansion plans, when my private cell phone rang. Not my business line. My personal, unlisted number that only Everett, Vivian, and Declan had. I frowned, looking at the unknown caller ID. I answered cautiously. Hello. Silence on the other end. Just the sound of someone breathing heavily, trying not to cry. Hello. I repeated. Who is this? Sloan, a voice whispered. It was tiny, terrified, and painfully familiar. My heart completely stopped. The pen slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the desk. Cora. Please don't hang up, my younger sister sobbed, her voice cracking. Please, Sloan. I didn't know who else to call. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I hadn't heard Cora's voice in 9 years. The last time I saw her, she was 12 years old, hiding in her bedroom while our mother dragged me out into the snow to take the blame for her fire. Part of me, the bitter, hardened part, wanted to hang up immediately. She was the golden child. She was the reason I lost my family. But the fear in her voice was visceral. It was the exact same fear I used to feel when I lived in that house. What's wrong, Cora? I asked, my voice cold but steady. I'm trapped, she cried softly. Mom is crazy, Sloan. She's completely lost her mind. I thought she loved me, but she doesn't. She just owns me. Over the next hour, the illusion of the golden child shattered completely. Cora poured her heart out, and the truth was horrifying. Genevieve hadn't raised a daughter, she had curated a show dog. Cora wasn't allowed to choose her own college major. She wasn't allowed to have friends Genevieve didn't approve of. She was 21 years old, but her phone was tracked, her emails were monitored, and she had a curfew. If she gained a pound, Genevieve starved her. If she spoke out of turn, Genevieve emotionally terrorized her for days. But the real crisis, the reason she finally broke down and found a private investigator to track my unlisted number, was the money. I found documents in her home office, Cora whispered, sounding terrified that someone might walk in on her. Sloan, the company is failing. She's drowning in debt from terrible investments. She's been illegally siphoning money out of my personal trust fund to cover payroll. When I confronted her about it, she locked me in the house. She took my car keys. She said if I try to leave or tell anyone, she will go to the police and tell them I was the one who burned down the warehouse 10 years ago. She recorded a conversation where I admitted it. She's going to use it to send me to prison if I don't let her take all my money. I closed my eyes, a sickening wave of revulsion washing over me. My mother had blackmailed her own 14-year-old daughter to take the fall for a crime, and now she was blackmailing her 21-year-old daughter with the exact same crime to steal her money. Genevieve was a parasite who fed on her own children. Cora, listen to me, I said, my voice hardening into steel. Are you in immediate physical danger? Has she hit you? No, Cora sobbed. Just the threats. And the isolation. I'm so scared, Sloan. I know you hate me. I know I let her throw you out. I was a coward. But please, you're the only person who survived her. Help me. I looked out the window of my office. The city lights twinkled in the darkness. 10 years ago, I was freezing in an alleyway, wishing someone would come save me. Nobody came. I had to save myself. But Cora wasn't me. She was weak, she was broken, and she was a victim of the same monster. More importantly, Cora was inside the fortress. "I don't hate you, Cora," I said quietly. "You were 12. It wasn't your fault. But if I am going to help you, if I am going to get you out of there, you have to do exactly what I say. No hesitation. No weakness. Anything," she whispered desperately. "Please." "You said you found documents in her home office," I said, pulling up a blank document on my computer. "I need them. I need the financial ledgers. I need the bank statements showing the transfers from your trust. And most importantly, I need the internal balance sheets for Sterling Logistics. Can you get back in there?" "Yes," Cora said, her voice shaking but gaining a tiny sliver of resolve. "She takes sleeping pills at night. I can sneak in. Take photos of everything. Make sure they are clear. Send them to a secure encrypted email address I am about to give you, and then immediately delete the photos from your phone. Do not get caught, Cora. If she catches you, she will accelerate her timeline." Okay, I can do it." Sloan. "Yes, thank you for not hanging up." "Get the documents, Cora. Then we talk." I hung up the phone. The pieces on the chessboard were finally shifting. The golden child had just become a Trojan horse. Genevieve was desperate, drowning in debt, and scrambling to keep her fake empire afloat. She was vulnerable. And my 20th birthday, the day I legally inherited 60% of the company she was currently destroying, was only months away. The trap was set. All I needed was for Genevieve to step right into it. If you are enjoying this story of survival and the slow, calculated build-up of ultimate revenge, please make sure to hit that like button on the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment below telling me which city you are watching from. Every single comment helps push this video to more people who love justice as much as we do. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let's see how the ultimate trap is sprung. The war had officially entered its final, bloodiest phase. I was 24 years old now, just months away from my 20th birthday and the legal execution of my grandmother's true will. But before that clock ran out, a massive opportunity dropped right into the center of the battlefield. The state of Pennsylvania announced a massive public bidding war for a government contract. They needed a primary logistics contractor to handle the distribution of state medical supplies, emergency equipment, and infrastructure materials across all 67 counties. The contract was worth $50 million. For Apex Freight, winning this contract would cement us as the undisputed king of regional logistics. We would double our fleet, open 3 new regional hubs, and secure guaranteed revenue for the next decade. But for Genevieve and Sterling Logistics, this contract was not about expansion. It was about pure, desperate survival. Declan's forensic analysis of the photos Cora had smuggled to us painted a devastating picture. Sterling Logistics was drowning. My mother had made a series of catastrophic real estate investments, trying to build automated warehouses that failed inspection. The company was bleeding cash, suffocating under a massive $12 million mountain of high-interest debt. If Genevieve did not win the $50 million state contract, her creditors would force her into bankruptcy within 6 months. She was a cornered animal. And cornered animals are incredibly dangerous. For 3 weeks, Cora had been sending us a steady stream of internal documents. Balance sheets, falsified safety reports, emails where Genevieve explicitly ordered her accounting team to artificially inflate their asset values to look solvent for the state bidding committee. We were building an absolute fortress of evidence. And then, suddenly, the encrypted emails stopped. 1 day passed. Then 2. Then 3. Total radio silence. I sat in my office, staring at my encrypted inbox, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Declan paced back and forth across the carpet, chewing on the cap of a pen. Then, on the 4th night, my personal phone rang. It was Cora's number. I answered immediately. "Cora? Where have you been?" It wasn't a conversation. It was a frantically recorded voicemail, left in a rush, filled with the sounds of hyperventilating and muffled sobbing. "Sloan," she caught me. "I forgot to delete one of the sent emails on the server. She knows I've been taking the documents. She doesn't know who I'm sending them to, but she knows I took them. She took my phone, my laptop, my car keys. She locked the deadbolt on my bedroom door from the outside. She told me if I don't sign a full confession taking the blame for the corporate embezzlement, she is going to take the recording of me admitting to the warehouse fire 10 years ago and hand it to the police. She's going to send me to prison, Sloan. Please. She said she's coming back in the morning with her lawyers. Help me. The message clicked and went dead. I stood up. The chair crashed backward onto the floor. Declan stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes wide. What happened? He asked. Genevieve caught her, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. She locked her in her room. She's extorting her own daughter with a 10-year-old crime to frame her for the company's financial collapse. I grabbed my coat. Call Everett. Wake him up. Tell him I need an emergency ex parte order of protection and a police escort for the extraction of an adult being held against her will under extortion. We are going to the mansion. It took Everett exactly 3 hours to pull the legal strings necessary to secure the paperwork. At 2 in the morning, a convoy pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate. I was in the lead SUV with Declan. Behind us was Everett in his black sedan, and behind him were 2 marked police cruisers. The rain was pouring down in absolute sheets, washing over the manicured lawns and the towering stone facade of the house I had been thrown out of 10 years ago. The gates were locked, but the police bypassed the security panel in seconds. We drove up the long, winding driveway. The tires crunched over the gravel, a sound I remembered from my childhood. We approached the heavy oak front door. The same door Genevieve had slammed in my face when I was 14. I didn't knock. I let the police officers pound on the heavy wood. Greenwich Police. Open the door. Lights flicked on inside the massive house. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. A moment later, the door swung open. Genevieve stood there in a floor-length silk robe. Her perfect blonde hair was slightly messy from sleep, but her face immediately twisted into a mask of arrogant outrage at the sight of the police uniforms. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "I am Genevieve Sterling. I will have your badges for." She stopped. The words completely died in her throat. I stepped out from behind the 2 police officers. I was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. My hair was pulled back perfectly. I looked nothing like the filthy, skeletal, sobbing 14-year-old she had kicked into the snow. I looked like a CEO. I looked like my grandmother. Genevieve's face drained of every single drop of color. She stared at me, her eyes widening in absolute shock, her mouth opening and closing without making a sound. It was as if she had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave. "Hello, Mother," I said calmly. The sound of my voice seemed to hit her like a physical blow. "Sloan," she whispered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here?" "I'm here for my sister," I said, stepping past her into the grand foyer. "You can't come in here." Genevieve suddenly shrieked, panic finally overriding her shock. She lunged forward to grab my arm, but one of the police officers smoothly stepped between us, holding up a hand. Everett stepped into the light, holding a thick stack of legal documents. "Genevieve Sterling, I have an emergency court order signed by a superior court judge. We have credible evidence that you are illegally detaining Cora Sterling against her will and subjecting her to criminal extortion. The police are here to ensure her immediate, safe removal from these premises." Genevieve looked at Everett, then back at me, her mind frantically trying to put the pieces together. You're the one she was sending the files to? You." I didn't answer her. I walked straight past the grand staircase, down the long hallway toward Cora's bedroom. Maxwell, my cowardly stepfather, was standing at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, looking absolutely terrified. He didn't say a word. He just shrank back into the shadows. I reached Cora's door. The heavy brass deadbolt had been locked from the outside. I flipped the latch and pushed the door open. Cora was huddled in the corner of her bed, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes red and swollen from crying. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she let out a broken, breathless sob. She scrambled off the bed and threw her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight. "I've got you," I whispered. "You're safe now. Pack a bag. We are leaving." 10 minutes later, we walked back into the foyer. Cora was clutching a duffel bag, staying firmly behind my shoulder. Genevieve was standing near the door, flanked by the police officers. She looked unhinged. The mask of the perfect, wealthy socialite had completely shattered. "Cora!" Genevieve screamed, her face red with fury. "If you walk out that door with her, you are dead to me. I will cut you off. You will have nothing. You will end up in the gutter just like she did." I stopped in the doorway and turned around slowly. I looked Genevieve directly in the eyes. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that echoed in the silent, cavernous foyer. "You already cut me off, Genevieve," I said smoothly. "And I didn't end up in the gutter. I ended up building an empire. See you at the state bidding hall next week." I walked out the door, shielding my sister from the rain, and left my mother standing in the ruins of her own making. The atmosphere inside the state capitol's grand bidding hall was electric. The room was massive, lined with dark mahogany panels, heavy velvet curtains, and rows of polished wooden desks facing a raised semicircle platform where the State Financial Oversight Committee sat. This was not a standard corporate meeting. This was a public, recorded hearing for a $50 million distribution of taxpayer money. The press was there, sitting in the back row with cameras ready. Industry leaders, local politicians, and rival CEOs filled the gallery. I sat at the front table designated for Apex Freight. Declan sat to my left, furiously tapping away on his encrypted tablet. To my right sat Everett, exuding the calm, terrifying confidence of a veteran lawyer who knew he held a royal flush. I wore a sharp navy blue suit, my hair perfectly styled, and a pair of thick, dark-rimmed glasses that gave me a slightly older, distinctly corporate look. Genevieve sat at the table directly across the aisle from me. She looked terrible. Oh, she was wearing a $10,000 designer outfit, and her hair was flawlessly blown out, but you couldn't hide the deep, dark circles under her eyes or the way her hands slightly trembled as she shuffled her papers. Maxwell sat next to her, sweating profusely, looking like a man walking to his own execution. Genevieve refused to look at me. She kept her eyes glued to the committee. She had spent the last week trying to figure out how I was connected to all of this, but because my name was buried under layers of LLCs and proxy directors, she still didn't realize the terrifying truth. She thought I was just an estranged daughter trying to rescue her sister. She didn't know I was the CEO of Apex Freight. The chairman of the committee tapped his microphone. "We will now hear the final presentations for the statewide medical logistics distribution contract. We have narrowed the candidates down to 2 finalists. Sterling Logistics, represented by CEO Genevieve Sterling, and Apex Freight, represented by their chief operating team. Miss Sterling, you have the floor." Genevieve stood up. She walked to the podium at the center of the room. She took a deep breath, plastered on her fake, glowing, philanthropic smile, and began her presentation. It was a masterclass in deception. She clicked through a beautifully designed slideshow featuring massive warehouses, shiny new trucks, and graphs that shot straight up into the sky. She spoke eloquently about Sterling Logistics' 30-year history, invoking my grandmother Beatrice's name to buy goodwill. She promised absolute efficiency, seamless distribution, and a rock-solid financial foundation. "We are a debt-free, highly liquid enterprise," Genevieve lied flawlessly into the microphone, her voice echoing through the grand hall. "We have the capital to purchase 50 new refrigerated units tomorrow. We are the safest, most reliable choice for the state of Pennsylvania." She finished to polite applause and a few nodding heads from the committee. She smiled, looking incredibly smug, and prepared to step down. "One moment, Miss Sterling," a sharp voice cut through the room. It was Holden, the state financial inspector. He was a notorious bulldog, a man who built his entire career on hunting down corporate fraud in government contracts. He adjusted his glasses and leaned over his microphone. "Miss Sterling, your presentation highlights a highly liquid enterprise. However, our preliminary algorithms flagged some inconsistencies in your secondary asset declarations. Can you confirm, under penalty of perjury, that Sterling Logistics is currently operating with a debt-to-equity ratio of less than 10%, as stated on page 4 of your bid? Genevieve didn't even blink. Absolutely, Mr. Holden. Our finances are completely transparent and independently audited. We have zero toxic debt. Holden frowned, looking down at his papers, seemingly satisfied but slightly hesitant. Very well. Thank you, Miss Sterling. Genevieve walked back to her table, sitting down with a victorious sigh. She shot a quick, venomous glance across the aisle at me, a silent message that she had just won the war. The chairman spoke again. We will now hear from the representatives of Apex Freight. Please step to the podium. I stood up. I buttoned my suit jacket. The entire room went dead silent. Genevieve's eyes narrowed in confusion as she watched me walk away from my table. I didn't carry a stack of glossy brochures. I didn't have a flash drive with a beautiful slideshow. I carried one single, heavy manila folder. I stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly up at the committee. Then, very slowly, I took off my dark-rimmed glasses and placed them on the wood. I turned my head and looked directly at Genevieve. The realization hit her like a freight train. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. Her jaw actually dropped. She gripped the edge of her table so hard her knuckles turned completely white. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Inspector Holden, and members of the committee, I said, my voice ringing out clear, steady, and utterly dominant. My name is Sloane Sterling. I am the founder, majority shareholder, and CEO of Apex Freight. A massive wave of murmurs and gasps swept through the gallery behind me. The press row instantly perked up, camera shutters clicking furiously. The Sterling versus Sterling war had just been announced on a public stage. Apex Freight was built on a foundation of absolute transparency, ruthless efficiency, and undeniable truth, I continued, projecting my voice over the whispers. In your packets, you will find our fully audited, unredacted financial statements for the past 3 years. We operate with zero long-term debt. Our on-time delivery rate is 99.7%. We do not just promise efficiency, we mathematically guarantee it. I paused, letting the silence command the room. I looked directly at Holden. However, Inspector Holden, transparency requires that I address a severe discrepancy brought before this committee today. A government contract of this magnitude cannot be awarded to an entity operating in bad faith. I opened the heavy manila folder. Moments ago, Genevieve Sterling stated under penalty of perjury that Sterling Logistics is a debt-free, highly liquid enterprise. That is a fabricated lie designed to defraud the taxpayers of this state. Objection. Genevieve suddenly screamed, leaping up from her chair. This is slander. This is a strange child throwing a public tantrum. She has no proof. Turn off her microphone. I have the internal ledgers, I said, my voice cutting through her screaming like a knife. I pulled out thick stacks of paper and handed them to the court clerk, who immediately distributed them to the committee members. These documents, I stated, pointing at the papers now sitting in front of a wide-eyed Inspector Holden, were secured directly from Sterling Logistics' internal accounting servers. They have been verified by a certified forensic accountant. They prove that Sterling Logistics is currently hiding $12 million in high-interest, toxic debt through a network of shell LLCs. Furthermore, the documents show a pattern of illegal cash transfers from a private family trust fund to cover payroll taxes over the last 8 months. Sterling Logistics is not highly liquid. They are mathematically insolvent, and they will be bankrupt before the first quarter of this contract. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Reporters were standing up, yelling questions. Politicians were frantically flipping through the pages I had just handed them. Inspector Holden's face turned bright red as he read the numbers. He looked up at Genevieve. Miss Sterling, he barked over the noise. Are these internal ledgers accurate? Because if they are, you just committed federal perjury in front of a state committee. Genevieve was shaking uncontrollably. She looked like she was going to vomit. She looked at Maxwell, who had buried his face in his hands. She looked at the reporters, whose cameras were flashing relentlessly in her face. And finally, she looked at me. She saw the 14-year-old girl she threw into the snow. She saw the absolute, terrifying execution of a 10-year plan. You, Genevieve whispered, pointing a shaking finger at me. You stole this from me. I didn't steal anything, I replied smoothly into the microphone. I simply showed them the truth. The chairman slammed his gavel down, desperately trying to restore order. Order. Order in the chamber. Miss Sterling, pending an immediate, emergency investigation by the State Financial Inspector, Sterling Logistics is officially disqualified from this bidding process. He turned to look at me, his expression a mix of shock and deep respect. Miss Sloane Sterling, given the flawless nature of your verified financials and the superiority of your logistical infrastructure, the state of Pennsylvania awards the $50 million distribution contract to Apex Freight. My table erupted. Declan slammed his hands on the desk in triumph. Everett leaned back and smiled a slow, dangerous smile. I stood at the podium, feeling the weight of the last 10 years finally lift off my shoulders. I looked at Genevieve. She was completely broken. Her empire was gone. Her reputation was incinerated on public television. She turned around, grabbed her designer bag, and practically ran up the aisle toward the heavy mahogany exit doors, trying to escape the flashing cameras and the shouting reporters. She pushed the heavy doors open, desperate for the hallway. But as the doors swung wide, the entire room went silent again. Standing in the hallway, blocking her exit, were 4 uniformed police officers and 2 detectives in plain clothes. They were holding a stack of warrants. Truitt goidamwachi la su koi dao. Kai Genevieve biak are koi toa na, kansat dang doi ba ta o kwa. The arrest of a high society CEO in the middle of a state capitol building is not a quiet affair. It is a spectacular, humiliating public spectacle, and Genevieve Sterling was forced to endure every single agonizing second of it. As I packed up my documents at the podium, I watched through the open double doors. The lead detective, a tall man with a completely unamused expression, stepped right into Genevieve's path. She tried to push past him, her panic making her erratic. "Excuse me, I have a medical emergency. I need to leave immediately," she demanded, trying to sound authoritative, but her voice cracking completely. "Genevieve Sterling," the detective said loudly, ensuring his voice carried over the din of the reporters who had rushed to the doorway. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Get your hands off me," Genevieve shrieked as a female officer grabbed her wrists and spun her around. The sound of the heavy metal handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed in the marble hallway. Click, click. "The charges," the detective continued, reading from his warrant over her screaming, "include multiple counts of corporate fraud, felony perjury, illegal embezzlement of private trust funds, and criminal extortion." They walked her through the lobby. Genevieve was hyperventilating, trying to hide her face behind her hair, but the press was ruthless. The cameras flashed endlessly, capturing the absolute destruction of a woman who had spent her entire life pretending to be better than everyone else. Maxwell didn't even try to run. He had remained seated at his table inside the hall, frozen in pure terror. 2 officers walked over, tapped him on the shoulder, and pulled him to his feet. They handcuffed him right there in front of the committee. He didn't put up a fight. He looked over at me, his eyes wide and pleading, as if expecting me to suddenly save the man who had threatened to lock me in a basement when I was burning with a fever. I just stared back at him with absolute, icy indifference. The fallout over the next 48 hours was catastrophic. The story exploded across local and national news. The headlines were brutal: Logistics Queen falls, Sterling CEO arrested for fraud, mother extorts daughters to hide debt. But the most devastating blow to Genevieve didn't come from the media. It came from her own husband. The morning after the arrest, Everett called me into his office. He poured 2 cups of coffee, sat down, and slid a copy of a police report across the desk. "Maxwell flipped," Everett said, a grim smile playing on his lips. It took the district attorney exactly 20 minutes in the interrogation room to break him. The man is an absolute coward. I picked up the report and read through the transcript. It was pathetic. The moment the detectives laid out the potential 20-year sentence for his involvement in the corporate fraud, Maxwell had started sobbing. He signed a plea deal turning state's evidence. He gave them everything. He gave them the passwords to the hidden offshore accounts. He gave them the names of the corrupt building inspectors Genevieve had bribed. But most importantly, Maxwell gave a full, recorded confession regarding my grandmother's will. He admitted on tape that 10 years ago, he had used his notary stamp to falsify the documents. He admitted that Beatrice was heavily sedated and largely unconscious when Genevieve guided her hand to sign the revoked will. He confessed that the true intent of Beatrice was to leave the controlling majority of the company to me, Sloane Sterling. With Maxwell's confession, Everett explained, leaning back in his chair, the fraudulent will is completely null and void. The probate court has already issued an emergency injunction freezing all of Genevieve's assets. Her bank accounts, the mansion, the investment portfolios, everything is locked down by the federal government pending the criminal trial. But the company reverts to the original, authentic will. Meaning? I asked, my heart hammering in my chest. Meaning, Miss Sterling, Everett said, raising his coffee cup in a toast, the moment you turn 25 in a few months, you legally inherit 60% of Sterling Logistics. Genevieve doesn't just lose her freedom. She loses the very empire she broke you to protect. That night, I drove past the county detention center. It was a massive, ugly concrete block surrounded by razor wire and floodlights. I pulled my car over on the side of the road and looked up at the tiny barred windows. I thought about Genevieve inside. She was stripped of her silk robes and designer coats. She was wearing a rough, scratchy orange jumpsuit. She was sitting on a thin mattress in a cold, concrete cell, eating terrible food, surrounded by people who did not care how much money she used to have. There was no sympathy in my heart. None. I had spent 10 years mourning the mother I wished I had. The woman in that cell was just a monster who had finally been put in a cage. I put the car in drive, turned the radio up, and drove back to my warm, safe apartment. The storm was finally over. Which brings us back to the present moment. The rain was beating against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office at Apex Freight. The city lights glittered in the dark. And my phone was sitting on the polished mahogany desk, vibrating with the sheer, pathetic desperation of a ruined woman. 101. 102. I sat back in my plush leather chair, watching the screen light up again. Call 103. For the past 3 days, Genevieve had been permitted limited access to a monitored phone in the detention center to coordinate her legal defense. Instead of calling lawyers, she had been obsessively, relentlessly calling me. My number had been given to her by Maxwell before he completely cut off contact with her. I knew exactly what she wanted. Her public defender had informed her that because Maxwell had flipped, she was facing a minimum of 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Her only hope of reducing that sentence was character references and leniency pleas from the victims. She needed me and Cora to drop our civil suits for extortion and emotional distress. She needed the daughter she had thrown away to save her life. The phone vibrated. Call 103. I picked it up. I pressed the green button. I brought the phone to my ear and said absolutely nothing. The line crackled with static from the prison system. Then I heard it. The sound of Genevieve sobbing. It wasn't the fake, elegant crying she used for the police 10 years ago. It was ugly, guttural, hyperventilating panic. Sloane? Sloane, is that you? Please tell me you're there. Please don't hang up, she begged, her voice high and terrified. I'm here, Genevieve, I said. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any emotion. Oh, thank God. Thank God, she cried. Sloane, you have to help me. You have to tell Everett to drop the civil charges. If you drop the civil charges, the DA might offer me a plea deal for 5 years. If you don't, they're going to put me in here for 20 years. I'll die in here, Sloane. I'm 52 years old. I can't survive 20 years in this place. I listened to her panic. I listened to the sheer terror of a woman realizing that there was no money left to buy her way out of consequence. Cora won't answer my calls, Genevieve continued, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Please, Sloan, you have to talk to her. Tell her I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I was stressed. The business was failing. I wasn't thinking clearly. I'm your mother. You can't let them do this to me. She paused, taking a ragged breath, preparing her ultimate bargaining chip. If you help me, she whispered desperately, I won't fight the probate court. I'll sign the company over to you immediately. You can have Sterling Logistics. You can have the CEO title. I'll give it all to you, Sloan. Just please, don't let them lock me away forever. I sat in my chair, looking out over the city I had conquered. You're offering to give me the company? I asked softly. Yes, everything, she sobbed, thinking she had found the lifeline. Genevieve, I said, my voice hardening into a blade of pure ice. You can't give me what I already took. Sterling Logistics is dead, Maxwell confessed. The original will is reinstated. I turn 25 next week, and I take legal ownership of 60% of your assets. I don't need your permission. I already won. Silence fell over the line. The heavy, crushing silence of total defeat. As for your apology, I continued, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the desk. You aren't sorry for what you did to me. You aren't sorry for what you did to Cora. You are only sorry that you got caught, and you are terrified of the concrete cell you are sitting in right now. Sloan, please. She whimpered, her voice completely broken. I'm begging you. Have mercy. Have a heart. Mercy? I repeated, a cold, bitter laugh escaping my chest. Do you remember the night you dragged me down the stairs by my sweater? Do you remember opening that heavy oak door and throwing my garbage bags into the snow? I was angry. I didn't mean it. You looked me dead in the eyes, I said, my voice rising in power, vibrating with 10 years of suppressed fury. You looked at your 14-year-old daughter, shivering in the freezing cold, and you told me I would be dead in a ditch by winter. You told me never to come back until I was ready to get on my knees and beg. Genevieve was weeping openly now, gasping for air. You were wrong, Mother, I said softly, delivering the final, fatal blow. That winter didn't kill me. It taught me how to survive the ice. You told me to beg. I didn't. Now you are the one begging, and I am the one closing the door. Stay warm in prison. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I could hear her screaming my name through the tiny speaker. I pressed the red button. The call ended. I opened my settings, selected the number, and pressed block caller. I set the phone face down on the desk. I closed my eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt completely, overwhelmingly free. There was no easy forgiveness. There was no tearful reunion. There was just justice, cold and absolute. 2 months later, the gavel fell in the federal courtroom. Genevieve Sterling was sentenced to 18 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Maxwell received a reduced sentence of 4 years in a minimum security facility for his cooperation. As the bailiffs led Genevieve out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she didn't look back. She kept her head down, completely broken, a ghost of the tyrant she used to be. On my 20th birthday, I sat in Everett's office and signed the final probate documents. I officially inherited 60% of Sterling Logistics. But I didn't keep the name. The Sterling legacy was poisoned by greed and cruelty. I immediately executed a corporate merger. I absorbed the remaining trucks, the client contracts, and the functional warehouses of Sterling Logistics directly into Apex Freight. I took the ashes of my mother's empire and used them to fuel the rise of the Phoenix. We became the largest, most dominant logistics firm in the tri-state area. But I didn't hoard the power. True strength isn't about ruling alone. It's about elevating the people who stood by you in the dark. I transferred 15% of the new, massive Apex corporate equity to Vivian, the woman who had found a filthy, homeless teenager screaming in her truck yard and gave her a cot and a chance. Vivian finally retired from the dirt lot, bought a massive piece of property out west, and never had to worry about a bill again. I made Declan my official chief financial officer and equal partner, giving him 25% equity. He had risked his career, stayed awake for days, and fought beside me when I was nothing but a shadow. And Cora. Cora needed time. She was deeply traumatized, learning how to exist in the world without a dictator telling her how to breathe. I took the remaining value of the Sterling estate, liquidated the massive mansion, and set up an ironclad, untouchable trust fund entirely in Cora's name. She moved to a quiet coastal town, started painting, and began the long, slow process of healing. We talk every Sunday. She is safe, and for the first time in her life, she is truly happy. As for me, I am 24, now 25, and I sit at the head of a massive boardroom table. I look out the window at the trucks rolling out of my dispatch yards, moving millions of dollars of freight every single day. I sleep well at night. A lot of people think that revenge is about destroying your enemies. They think it's about screaming, fighting, and tearing people down to make them feel the pain they caused you. But they are wrong. The greatest, most devastating revenge you can ever achieve is not destruction. It is building a life so beautiful, so incredibly successful and full of peace, that the people who tried to break you become absolutely irrelevant. They become a footnote in your history, while you become the headline. Genevieve tried to bury me in the snow, but she only taught me how to withstand the winter. Many people say I was too cruel to send my own mother to jail and ignore her pleas. If it were you, would you have listened to that 103rd call and forgiven her? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss other dramatic Reddit stories on our channel.